Jerusalem, the Contested City. Lecture 7. The Mother of all the Churches, 325 through 635 of the Common Era.
If one were to look at Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem in the year 200 of the Common Era, one would see a spanking new Gentile city with its Gentile name, Aelia Capitolina, and its Roman buildings, its new Roman buildings, its broad main street. It would look like many other cities in the Middle East, many new cities in the Middle East. One looks at the city of Jerusalem in the year 400 of the Common Era, 200 years later, one would discover a Christian city, a notably Christian city with a Christian reputation as a holy city. And what happens in the intervening 200 years? Well, the short answer, the very short answer, is that the Roman Empire becomes the Christian Roman Empire. The population increasingly becomes Christian, and the emperor is converted to Christianity and begins to put the resources of the empire behind the Christian religion. That's the very short answer. To be a little more detailed, Christianity proceeds over the course of the 300 years between Jesus, the death of Jesus in 30 of the Common Era, and the conversion of Constantine, just for symmetrical purposes, let's say 330 of the Common Era. Over those 300 years, it passes through a number of states around the Mediterranean, a number of positions, a number of kinds of statuses. It goes from being a sort of version of Judaism. It's a Jewish movement. It starts out that way. It becomes separated from the Jews for a variety of reasons and becomes a separate religion called Christianity. It begins to be persecuted by the Romans, who have removed it now from all the privileges and exemptions granted to the Jews. So there's persecution beginning at about 200 and continuing between 200 and 300. It then, at the end of that period, after attempts to wipe it out have failed, there is an edict of toleration. It is now permitted to exist as a religion. And then the emperor, the same one who tolerated it, Constantine, becomes himself a Christian, and from being a tolerated religion becomes a favored religion. Right? The resources of the state are put behind it, and then after Constantine, in the year 380, 381, Christianity is declared to be the official and only religion of the Roman Empire. So the trajectory of Christianity over those couple of hundred years is rather remarkable. But what we're looking at here now are rather specific acts in a rather specific place. We're looking at Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the site, as we've already seen, of some of the last significant events in the life of Jesus. But significant or not, there's a difference between being significant in the mind and being known to the general populace. And the difference between the events of Jesus' day and their understanding at the time of Constantine is that Constantine, in effect, put a frame around the places that mark those events in Jerusalem. He enshrined them. And one of the important elements of a holy place or a holy city is this process of enshrinement, which I have already compared to just simply putting a frame around a picture. As you can imagine, you're looking upon a landscape, now you're framing it. And that frame draws attention to it. It says this is important, right? This is worth looking at closely. And that's what Constantine does with Jerusalem and a variety of other places in Palestine. And it's at this point, of course, that we can now call it Palestine, that the Romans have resurrected the old name. Palestine comes from Philistia, the name of the coastal plain of the original Eretz Israel, the last holdouts against the occupation of the land of Canaan, were the Philistines who lived along the coast. And that name has survived, sort of underground, sometimes being used, sometimes not being used. But the Romans officially called their provinces, and they were three. This area, this Eretz Israel, once this place the size of New Jersey, was now divided into three different Roman provinces, called unimaginatively Palestine I, Palestine II, Palestine 3. Palestine 1 was Judea, Palestine 2 was the Galilee and part of the Golan Heights, and Palestine 3 was the south. And so we can call it Palestine. And what Constantine did was he's important in the history of the Christian church in that he assumed leadership of this church. He's a layman. He's an emperor. He's not a priest. He's not a bishop. He's the emperor who felt responsible for the peace and prosperity of Christendom. And so when there was a problem among the Christians, heresy, divergence of opinion, he summoned in the year 325 a general council of all the bishops of the church at a place called Nicaea, close to his new capital of Constantinople, a place that he founded himself on the Bosporus, which had been formerly a tiny little village called Byzantium. So sometime, by the way, this Christian Roman Empire, at least in its eastern form, is sometimes called the Byzantine Empire, going back to that old name for Constantinople. But near Constantinople, is a place called Nicaea, and that's where he convoked these bishops, and the first great council of the church began to unfold there. After the Council of Nicaea, Constantine addressed himself to another project, which was the enshrinement of the Jesus sites in Palestine. And to accomplish this, he issued orders, and by the way, this information now that we have comes from the biographer of Constantine and the most famous church historian, a man by the name of Eusebius. Eusebius died in 340 and wrote, in addition to a life of Constantine, he also wrote a history of the church. It's the first great ecclesiastical history we have, and we are dependent on him for a lot of the information. There are other accounts of Constantine's career, but Eusebius is one of the most important. At any rate, we discover from Eusebius that he instituted this project after the Council of Nicaea. He issued orders to the governor of Palestine, provincial Roman governor, and to the bishop of Jerusalem, because this is a Christian community, that they were to locate the sites identified with the life of Jesus, and they were to spare no expense whatsoever in adorning them in the appropriate way, of building shrines, churches over the sites. And they were to use the state funds. There is no separation of church and state in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had always subsidized religion of various types. It had built all of these. Today one can still see the remains of the great temples on the hills of Rome. So there was no hesitation about supporting religion, and Constantine was supporting his religion, which was Christianity. And so the identification process began first. First the identification and then the enshrinement. And the identification was the local tradition. They just simply relied on the local tradition. Jesus had been dead 300 years. There had been a Christian community in Jerusalem for most of that period, continuously for most of that period. And they presumably had some knowledge of where these things had occurred. And the information they provided was that the site of Jesus' burial and the site of Jesus' execution, once outside the walls of the city, Herod's walls, now were inside the city, and they were under Hadrian's Western Forum, that is to say, the forum, the administrative and commercial center that Hadrian had built in the city. And at the northern side of this forum was a temple to Aphrodite, and the sites were under there. Constantine's agents simply cleared the site. They removed the temple, and they dug down, and they found the tomb. And they found in the debris a couple of crosses, a number of crosses, 3 of them to be precise. As the Gospel tells us, Jesus was crucified with 2 thieves. And it's at this point that Constantine's mother, whose name is Helena, enters the story. We're now probably passed over from historical information to legend, because there are varying rumors and stories about this that don't quite cohere. But this is the traditional one, that Helena, his mother, who may have been one of the influences behind his conversion, was interested herself in this project and was there, and she was present at the discovery of these crosses in the debris, and near them was also the legend, the indictment of Jesus, which had been tacked to the cross. We get this information from the Gospels. It said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And so there it was. Now the question was, which one was the cross of Jesus? No one was interested in the cross of the other two, either pickpockets or political activists who were crucified with Jesus, depending on how you understand thief. But they used a common sense approach. They applied the three crosses serially to a person who was suffering a serious illness, and one of the crosses affected a cure. And so therefore, that was the true cross. So the discovery of the true cross. And one can see today, beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the cave in which this discovery was made, the underground area where it was made. So Constantine, so the first phase is over. The sites have been discovered. The site of the burial, the site of the crucifixion, discovered on the north side of Hadrian's Forum in Jerusalem. And so now comes the second phase, which is the enshrinement of the sites. And so for the tomb is cut away. It's a cave inside the side of a hill. It is cut away so that part of the cave remains, and what is left is a little house-like structure around which Constantine's architects build a colonnade, and over which they put a dome, which is open at the top. There's a small oculus or hole at the top of this. So here now is a kind of domed shrine around the tomb, this little house-like structure, which is the tomb of Jesus. And that nearby is a small mound, a small hillock, representing what is called in the Gospels Golgotha, or the place of the skull, which in Latin translation comes out to be Calvarium, or in English Calvary. It's the same thing. And this then is the site of the crucifixion. It's in an open courtyard. And then starting from there and proceeding eastward is a very large basilica, which ends at its eastern end in a courtyard and monumental gateway, and goes down to the Cardo, to Hadrian's main boulevard of Jerusalem. So its entry, the main entry to this cathedral, to use a slightly later term, is you enter it from the Cardo, from the main street of Jerusalem, main north-south street. You go through the courtyard into the basilica, and if you go out the back side of the basilica, you're in the open area where the little hillock is of the crucifixion, and then further on is the domed shrine of the tomb of Jesus. And so this is the basis of the enshrinement of the sacred places connected with Jesus, but that's only the beginning. That lots of things, the Gospels present lots of things in Jerusalem that are connected with Jesus, and that eventually, over the course of the years, these places are identified one after the other, so that, and we can tell this from the accounts of pilgrims who go there, which I'll get to in a minute, that we know, for instance, that somebody is going to show the house of Caiaphas, where Jesus was tried, where the hearing was held that night. The upper room where the Last Supper was held is identified. The upper room, which turns out to be the same upper room, where the apostles were at Pentecost. Place where Jesus, the trial before Pilate was conducted. Place where Jesus was scourged before he was executed, etc. All of these sites that are mentioned in the Gospels. The place where Stephen was executed, the place where James' body was thrown off from the pinnacle of the temple. All of this are identified in Jerusalem, and shrines are built over them, so that Jerusalem ends up as a kind of enshrined place with the series of these places, and it now is in the process. Constantine has now done what he set out to do. He put frames around the places identified with the life of Jesus. He does the same thing, for example, in Bethlehem, that the cave where Jesus is supposed to have been born is identified, and a dome is put over it, and a long basilica stretches out next to it, and so you have the Church of the Nativity, right? And the spot where Jesus is born it's covered with marble. There is a hole, and you can look down into it and see the bedrock, and around this hole on the marble is a silver star that you look through, and you see the actual bedrock of where Jesus was born, the traditional site. So all of these things are now identified, and they've been identified by the erection of what I've called a basilica. A basilica is a building borrowed from the Greeks and the Romans, and what it means is simply a royal hall. to build their churches, the Christians, and the Jews for their synagogues, the same thing, took this building, this basilica-type building, which has no religious connotations for the Greeks and the Romans, and used it for their sacred buildings. They didn't build their sacred houses on the model of temples. They used a secular building, the basilica. What a basilica is, it's a rectangular building, longer than it is wide, and the entry, triple entry, is on one side, of the short side, and at the far end, as you walk in, is what is called an apse. It is the wall bulges out at the rear, and in that bulge is located the chair of the emperor or the judge or whoever is presiding over what's going on in this hall. And that's the form that is used for these churches. So there's a basilica, a large basilica in Jerusalem, a large basilica in Bethlehem. And there's going to be other churches up on the Mount of Olives to mark the site of the ascension of Jesus, etc., etc. Now, the result of this, the consequences of this, now that Constantine has put the frames around the places, is that inevitably pilgrimage is going to start. The people are going to come to these places, to visit the places, to venerate the places. The sanctity has now been defined and now been highlighted. Its profile has been raised. It's really as holy as it always was, except now it's been highlighted, the holiness. And so we have the beginnings of Christian pilgrimage, and we have two very early pilgrims. We have one who is known by no further designation as the Bordeaux pilgrim, because that's where he came from. That's all we know about him. And he was in Palestine about the year 333. So Constantine's work was still in progress. He was there while some of this stuff was still being built. And he tells, gives a kind of brief account of what it's like, what he saw. But the more interesting one is the woman called Egeria, who is a nun from somewhere in Europe, who gives her account of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and it is exceedingly detailed and exceedingly interesting. She tells about the crowds of other pilgrims who are there. This is 380 now. This is only 50 years into the career of Jerusalem as a Christian holy city, and already there are crowds from all over the Christian world, according to her, who are visiting the city. But one thing that is interesting about this is that Egeria gives us an idea of what is developing in Jerusalem as a kind of liturgy. Right? A liturgy is a ritual, public and social ritual, right? Religious, and as opposed to private devotions. Liturgical devotions are public and formal. And there is developing in Jerusalem a liturgy which is connected precisely with the sites identified with Jesus, the places where Jesus did this or that or the other. And what it amounts to is that these pilgrims have come to Jerusalem, and they've come quite specifically during Holy Week, during the time of Passover, right? That these events actually took place on the anniversary of these events. So the pilgrimage season now in Jerusalem is clearly attached to Easter time. Easter is what Christians call the feast of the resurrection of Jesus. So it's really that whole week that you want to be in Jerusalem for that, so that you can go through the reenactment of these events connected with the life of Jesus. And this liturgy develops by going from place to place as the events are celebrated, so that you are on Thursday, you're at the upper room at the site of the Last Supper, and then you go to Gethsemane, and the next day you're at the house of Caiaphas. You follow the path of Jesus, right, which has its climax in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, inside Constantine's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where there's a celebration of the execution of Jesus, the crucifixion, the sad day of Friday, which Christians end up calling Good Friday. And then Saturday is a long period of sort of waiting it out. It's the Jewish Sabbath, although nobody is calling it that at this stage. And then finally on Sunday there is a triumphant liturgy celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. What had actually happened was the discovery of the empty tomb. And what Christians supposed happened was the resurrection of Jesus, and that is celebrated inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that there are appropriate prayers and appropriate acts that go on here. A whole sort of dramatic series is happening. Now, there's a thin line between a reenactment in a kind of dramatic way, and that also happens in Christianity. It's called a passion play, and it can be staged anywhere, and passion plays become a kind of major art form during the Middle Ages in Christian Europe, where the Passion is reenacted by actors on a stage, though, or in any given city or even inside a church. But what's going on here is that this is being reenacted at the actual sites, and it's not being reenacted so much as people are playing. There's nobody playing Jesus in this, that the faithful are simply retracing the steps of Jesus and saying the appropriate prayers at these places. And the gospel accounts are being read at these places. So it's a prayer ritual, not a dramatic reenactment. The dramatic reenactment takes place, as I say, in what are called passion plays, and it's a slightly different form, although the line between them is somewhat thin. Right? There's a kind of leakage back one from the other. Now, looking at these narratives of pilgrims, it is possible now to sort of lay out the Christian appearance of Jerusalem, right? Because we now know which sites have been identified and what kinds of buildings have been located there. So it is possible to get some sort of sense of what this city looked like, an increasing sense of what it looked like. And it's one thing that we notice is that in these pilgrim accounts is that the buildings continue to multiply. The Christian buildings continue to multiply inside the city of Jerusalem. And the reason for this is, to go back to the very beginning of this course, one of the characteristics of a holy city is that it has more investment in it than would normally be expected in a city of that size or in that place. And Jerusalem has been a classic example of this all the way through, starting with David and Solomon down to this point. Constantine poured state funds into this, and it continues. And so we have the royal family continuing to put money into Jerusalem. Emperors and particularly their wives begin to put in. And there's one in particular, Eudokia, who is the wife of the Emperor Theodosius, who in a palace sort of scandal or plot falls out of favor with her husband, and spends a good part of her life between the years 443 and 460 of the Common Era living in Jerusalem as a kind of, she's been called sort of the Empress of Palestine, right? That she's an empress in exile, but she's living in Jerusalem, and a lot of money. Eudokia is a pious lady who's pouring a lot of money into the city. And it is endowed by emperors too, most famously, I guess, and the last great donor before the arrival of the Muslims is the Emperor Justinian, who rules between 527 and 565. And Justinian is famous for a number of reasons, especially in his codification of Roman law. But in Jerusalem, a couple of things. Justinian is responsible for, I don't know how to put this exactly, the invention of the hospital. Right? There had been clinics. Medical facilities had existed all through Roman times. And there were clinics. There were places that you walked in and you got your wounds taken care of, like connected with gladiatorial games. There were clinics. There was the emergency room next to the gladiators' quarters, where you tried to sew your arm back on, I suppose. And there were also hotels types. There were lodgings, inns all over the Roman Empire. But what a hospital is the combination of a clinic and an inn, or a hotel and a clinic. And it comes together for the first time in Jerusalem, right? We'll see, one of the characteristics of pilgrimage is that it attracts elderly people, right? Because part of the attraction of pilgrimage is to go to this place and perhaps die there. Now, that's to put it in a kind of grisly fashion, but there's a truth to that. So there are more elderly people on pilgrimages than would be general in the population. Not only that, a pilgrimage is frequently a rather demanding trip and may take a lot out of you, and you may expire. So there are health problems for these pilgrims. And Justinian sponsored the first hospital in Jerusalem for the care, with boarding facilities for the care of the sick and the elderly. But he also, and this is sort of interesting, he built a church in Jerusalem, and it was called the Nia, or the New Church of the Virgin Mary. And it was, according to his historian, his official historian, an enormous structure. He gives us some of the dimensions. Now, the church was destroyed by an earthquake, a number of years later, maybe 50 or 60 years later. This thing wasn't there very long, and an earthquake destroyed it. It was shook it to its foundations. The church came tumbling down. So much for the Nia Church of Justinian. We know about this from Procopius, the historian who tells us about this, but we also know about it from two other rather interesting places. First of all, we know about it from archaeology. Israeli archaeologists have discovered the foundations of the Nia Church, right, where Procopius says it was, and they've also found the inscription, the dedicatory inscription of this church. So we have a historian's account of a church that once existed and no longer exists, and we have found the remains of the church. We have found the foundations and the inscription. But we know more about this church. It also is represented on a map, a famous map of the Holy Land. Right? I mentioned before, so just in passing, a thing called the Madaba map. And the Madaba map, it's called Madaba map because it's in a place called Madaba in what is today Jordan, and it's in the sanctuary of this church. The floor of the sanctuary is a very large mosaic map of the Holy Land, probably for the use of pilgrims. And across the map are depictions of various cities in the empire. And one of the cities that is depicted in the form of cartouches, roughly maybe 2 feet wide and 1.5 feet high, these cartouches, shows a depiction of the city. And there is a depiction of the city of Jerusalem. And there's a cartouche of Jerusalem. And it's all in mosaic, and portraying the city as it was in the year 570. Right? And there it is. It's laid out. We can see the Cardo. We can see Hadrian's Cardo with the colonnaded streets. We can see the great Church of the Holy Sepulchre built by Constantine. And over there on the right side of the map, which is the south, we're looking at Jerusalem from the west, and slightly above it. The artist has managed to raise himself 500 or 1,000 feet above the city and to give a bird's eye view in his own imagination of what the city looked like, looking from the west. And over there on the right side, the southern side of Jerusalem, there is clearly identifiable the Nia, the Church of Justinian, this large edifice that Justinian had built and which some years later was destroyed by an earthquake and no longer existed. So we know about it from Procopius, the historian. We know about it because of the archaeologists who have found the remains, and we know about it from the Madaba map. This may be the end of the glory of Christian Jerusalem in stage one, because what happens next is kind of brutal. The Eastern Romans, the Byzantines, however one wants to call this Christian Roman Empire, and the Iranian or Persian Empire on the other side of the steppe have been fighting a war for many centuries. They had been punching each other out again and again with no consequential effects. Neither side managed to knock the other out. But in the 7th century, beginning in 614 and ending in 622, 628, thereabouts, each side managed to knock out the other, right, in a kind of double knockdown, and both lay there prostrate, and it was an easy matter for the Muslims to walk over the corpses of both of them, or the flattened bodies of both of them, and occupy that territory. But that's still in the future. I'm talking about this double knockout. The first knockout came when the Persians broke through the defenses of the Byzantine Empire from the east, overran the eastern provinces of this empire, including the Palestines, and occupied the city of Jerusalem. And they carried off the most famous relic that the Christians possessed, the relics of the true cross, which were kept in a box, in a casket, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and carried off to their capital in Iraq. And they then handed over the administration of the city to the Jews, who had been forbidden to live there, right, before, and the Jews came pouring back in. I don't know how many there were. There couldn't have been that many. But they exacted, according to our sources, a bloody vengeance on the Christian population of Jerusalem for about 3 years, between 614 and 617. It was a bad time in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius is reassembling his own army in Armenia, and when he is ready, he launches a counterattack against the Persians, knocks them out, right, takes their capital, regains the relics of the true cross, and carries them back, and in 629 of the Common Era, there is a procession into Jerusalem, a solemn procession, and the restoration of the relics of the cross into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Anastasis, as it's really called in Greek. Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a Western name for it. The relics of the cross are restored there once again. Now, what is curious about this is that there might be some sort of echo of this whole business in the Quran. The 30th chapter of the Quran, these revelations given to Muhammad, about which we'll hear much more, the first 5 verses seem to talk about 2 victories that occurred in the nearer land. And it has been taken by many people to be a reference to this double knockout of the Byzantines and the Persians. Muhammad and Mecca are thousands of miles away. It's 30 days caravan trip from the frontiers of what is today Jordan down to Mecca. So this news had traveled a long way indeed, if this is indeed the reference in the Quran. But there it is. Jerusalem is now a Christian city, is entirely a Christian city, is filled with Christian monuments. It is not feeling particularly healthy. It has lots of problems, both because of that Persian invasion and because of the increasing rivalry that's going on among Christian groups inside the city and indeed inside the entire empire. And just around the corner, are the Muslims, right? Just around the corner and to the south. The Bishop of Jerusalem in the 630s, early in the 630s, gives a sermon, and which is preserved. And in the course of the sermon, he announces that there will be no Christmas celebration this year in Bethlehem, right? Because there have been disturbances along the road to Bethlehem. The disturbances were the Muslim armies. Right? They were that close, and they still had not quite been identified, but they were approaching the city of Jerusalem.
After listening to Lecture 7, a student posed this question to Professor Peters. How do people know where the big events in the life of Christ took place? Let's listen to the professor's response.
There's really no way of telling. The Gospel gives various hints about where certain things took place, but they're not terribly indicative hints that an upper room somewhere in Jerusalem, crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem, tried before the governor of Jerusalem, so that there are generic things, but nothing terribly specific that you can tie it down. What these identifications are based on, from Constantine onward, are local traditions, right? And local traditions are sometimes reliable, and sometimes they're not reliable. Sometimes communities do remember where certain things happened, and because they have reason to remember where certain things happened. This is, after all, there's a continuous Christian presence there, and this was their Messiah and Savior, so why shouldn't they remember where certain things happened? On the other hand, we all know that guides and such frequently tell people what they want to hear. And so there are those 2 elements. There is the reliability of certain kinds of local traditions. On the other hand, there is the easy ability to just sort of make up stories as you go along. And so it's very difficult to sort of pick and choose about where this happened or that happened. I'm guessing, if I had to make a guess, I would say that the site of Jesus' crucifixion is probably fairly highly reliable identification. The site of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem is probably very low likelihood of identification. I mean, the reasons I say that are very complicated, but I mean, if you just want a kind of general ballpark answer, yes, some of these traditions are more credible than others, but it's very difficult sorting them out.
This ends Lecture 7.